This is Aleksandra Muraj's essay, The Longevity and Vitality of Zagreb Annual Fairs, Part 1. I'll skip the abstract. We are on the eve of the 20th century. It says in the year 1900, and the eye of the reader who picked up Obzor, a leading daily newspaper at that time, on Tuesday, August 21st, was probably taken by an article entitled Kralevsky Sejam, the Royal Fair. And this is what he would have read. The favorable weather that followed the universal clearing up of the skies just prior to this largest of fairs, held in Zagreb from times long past, attracted a host of people from near and far to the capital city of Croatia. Foreigners actually swarmed through the city streets yesterday. As early as on Saturday, people from Zagreb and visitors from outside the city started to visit the fairgrounds. Yesterday evening, they were the site of extraordinary vitality, endless fairground flurry, and deafening noise that spread from the various panoramas, the merry-go-rounds, all sorts of hurdy-gurdies and other not quite harmonious music. However, only when one turns left towards the tavern keeper's tents and stalls that are lined up along the entire fairgrounds on the left side of the way. Only when one goes to the right, where one finds the grilled meat stall keepers, those selling bread and all sorts of buns, can one really feel what the Royal Fair means in Zagreb. Almost every tent has its own music. More or less harmonious, there is cheerful music in each one, and here and there, dancing to the most diverse accompaniments. Here, gypsies playing furiously, their spinning and dance with their favored maidservant as her mistress waits impatiently. Tamburica players here, an accordion there, and noise and singing here, while there are toasts and political talk over there. But wherever you turn, it is lively and cheerful. End quote. Today's reader could well ask what the occasion was that attracted such crowds to Zagreb. Why were some fairs given the royal appellation? From which times past did they date? From which social strata did their participants, who ostensibly enjoyed themselves so much, derive? It is generally known that a fair is one of the forms of direct trade in the open air, but we are not speaking here of the customary daily or weekly fair, but of annual events. That institution played a notable role in the life of European inhabitants from as early as the Middle Ages, and that is much from that aspect of both the trade and the entertainment that formed its integral part. The political and economic importance of the fairs is confirmed by the historical fact that the privilege of holding annual fairs could be conferred on a particular city solely by a crowned head. Such fairs had their place in the course of the liturgical year, since they were linked, without exception, to the celebration of a local parish patron saint. However, that calendar holiday, a day marked by church celebration and forgiveness of sins, occupied only the central day of the 14-day fair period, which came to an end 7 days after the holy day. If we can identify with the medieval modes of transport and other overall circumstances, we will understand the justification for such prolonged duration. Such events gave merchants and craftsmen the hoped that they would manage to sell all the merchandise with which they had set out to what were often considerably distant markets. In that process, as historians have informed us, they had to be prepared, I quote, to bear high transport costs and to pay numerous tolls and to expose themselves to unpleasant and even perilous travel along poor roads and through thick forests where, along with wild animals, there were often also bands of brigands. R. Horvat, 1994, 53. The various companies of entertainers which shared the same itineraries in making the rounds of the annual fairs also had no protection from single jeopardy. Part 2. The special grant for holding an annual fair marking the day of their diocese's patron saint in medieval Zagreb was first procured by the chapter. This was St. Stephen Scipion, the Hungarian king, whose saint's day is celebrated according to the calendar on August 20th. The charter of King Andrea, issued back in 1227, according to Kalchik, 1889, part. Oh, Christ. Some Roman numerals. 1999, I don't know. No. I'll come back to it. Confirms the already entrenched holding of the fair, which means that the journalist was completely right in emphasizing the longevity of the Zagreb tradition, then already more than 6 centuries old. Because of its patron, Stephen the King, the people called the fair Kraljevo of the King, or Royal Fair, in keeping with the customs of that time, which characterized the holding of annual fairs in other European cities. Zagreb's Royal Fair was announced by the pealing of the large bell on the cathedral and the raising upon it of the flag, then red in color over the entire surface, that continued to fly for the entire 14 days. Source, Herc, 1987, colon 106. There were familiar indications to one and all, nonverbal messages of fair time and celebration, taking place on the square in front of the cathedral. However, the chapter's neighbor, Gradek, had no intention of being left behind, so that it received the right from King Bela IV in 1256 to organize its own 14-day fair to be held around the day of its parish's patron saint. From that time, the holy day year was marked by the citizens of Gradec through their Mark's Fair, organized around April 25th on the square in front of the Church of St. Mark. And it did not stop there. Since the city expanded into its suburbs during the ensuing decades, King Ludovic granted permission on March 10th, 1372, for the holding of yet another fair beside the then parish Church of St. Margaret in the area that is now Preradovic Square. The central date of St. Margaret's festivities was July 13th. Trading was not conducted in a disorganized manner, but was rather framed by norms of behavior that had to be respected. All right, I'm going to hit you with these footnotes. Footnote 1. This is about Zagreb, the city. Modern Zagreb grew out of 2 settlements. King Ladislav founded a diocese on the left bank of the Medvesac stream in 1094, and the chapter settlement developed beside it. While on the hill beside the right-hand bank of the same stream, the Gradec settlement was granted the status of a free royal city by the charter of King Bela IV in 1242. Together with the suburbs that sprouted up around them through the centuries, Gradec Zagreb and the chapter united into an integral municipality in 1850. Let's continue. A price list for merchandise was set in order to define the payment of market tariffs. Thanks to a preserved price list from the mid-14th century, we know what was brought for sale at the annual Zagreb fairs. Prices are given for domestically made and imported cloth, linen yarn, and male and female clothing made of cloth and leather, while the foodstuffs listed were grain, salt, wine, fresh and salted fish, crabs, cheese, and honey, and wax. The domestic animals were largely horses and cattle, but also sheep and goats. They were also trading in tame animals and wild beasts, and in timber and furniture. That's Surser, 1991:22. Foreign merchants were obliged to respect the regulations on the storing of merchandise. Particular areas in the vicinity of the fair were set aside for that purpose. It was strictly prohibited to store goods anywhere else. That's zoning, baby. The connection between the Zagreb fairs of that time with Western European trading rules is also confirmed by the institution of Troika Day, that is, the truce of God. This originally entailed a ban on the waging of war and the use of weapons in personal altercations, and subsequently the rule of peace that was to be kept alongside the main holy days or particular days in the week. The institution was first introduced by the Roman Catholic Church in France in 1033, whence it spread to Germany, England, Spain, and Italy. The troika was brought from Germany to Zagreb, where it was under the particular protection of the crown and the city government from the 14th century. On the basis of preserved documents, Chikachik informs us that the troika was in force during the entire 2-week duration of Margaret's Fair. All court prosecutions in the city ceased at that time, while 2 city representations, the custodes trogarum, oversaw the keeping of the peace. Its disruption was strictly sanctioned, and punishment could be the imposition of fines, for example, for cursing, fighting, and theft, or in the case of more serious offenses, the infliction of physical punishment such as beatings, the cutting off of hands, and even hanging or burning at the stake. The following is a concrete example. In the year 1499, a certain Matija set out for the Margaret Fair and had to pass through one of Zagreb's forests on his way there. He was attacked there by 2 robbers who stole not only his money, but also his clothing and jewelry, although they did spare his life. Acting on Matija's report of the incident, the city guards found the 2 brigands and the stolen property at the fair. When they were arrested and admitted their guilt, they were immediately sentenced to death and to having their bodies crushed by a wheel. However, it was taken into account that they did not take Matija's life, and the sentence was modified to death by hanging, which is carried out on the same day, probably in the presence of the public at the fair. Wow. But get this. Despite all the cruelty of the punishments, the rule of the truce of God did not always succeed in restraining even more major and belligerent undertakings. This is demonstrated by an incident from the 15th century, a time marked by frequent conflicts between the inhabitants of Gradec and the chapter. One such altercation took place during the holding of Margaret's Fair in 1433. The inhabitants of Gradec broke into the chapter area, stole everything they could find, and then attacked the cathedral with the intention of killing the canons who had taken refuge there. However, the attack was fought off by the armed troops of the band and the bishop, and they were aided by, quote, many foreigners who were in Zagreb on the occasion of the large fair, end quote. For the people of Zagreb at the time, the large annual fairs provided more than an opportunity to buy a wider range of goods than that usually being offered to them, to supply themselves with more unusual foodstuffs, or to acquire more favorably heads of livestock. They could also be entertained by the shows put on by itinerant buffoons and jugglers, treat themselves in the tavern keepers' tents, and gladden their hearts to music and dance. It would seem that some of the revelers carried things too far. Namely, Bishop Kazotic, who fulfilled the duty from 1303 until 1318, issued a public censure to individuals who took advantage of such occasions, as he said, quote, to get drunk, fight, sing ribald songs, and lead off in colo dances, that is, circle dances, in which they dance in a roguish manner. End quote. That was how things were in the medieval area. I'm sorry. That was how things were in the medieval era. Part 3. And what was the situation in the New Age? After the prolonged conflict between the chapter and Gradec about who was entitled to collect the fair charges and markets tolls, both municipalities finally agreed in 1633 that the fairs would become theirs in common. Between 1636 and 1641, they ensured a more suitable site with more space for trade and entertainment, located in the vicinity of a drinking water spring. This was the largest flat area around what was then the Medosevic Spring, which soon became the name of the entire square, renamed Harmica in the 18th century. Zagreb's central city square, Ben Joseph Jelacic Square, is located at that site today. The annual and weekly fairs were held there for the next 2 centuries, right up until 1826. Ain't that fascinating? Their additional significance for their broader geographical region was confirmed by the Slovenian polymath Janez Vajkard Valvasor in the 17th century. Also describing Zagreb in his better-known work Slava Vojvodine Kranjski, the Era des Herzogovskrain from 1689, he mentioned its annual fairs that were visited by many merchants from Carniola and Styria. Valvasor emphasized that the largest among the fairs was Karljevo, the Royal Fair. That's according to R. Horvat, 1992:33. However, the Zagreb merchants did not look with favor on their competitors from outside the city and from abroad. United into the merchant guild of the Free Royal City of Zagreb, they drew up regulations on trading that were confirmed for them by King Leopold in Vienna on February 19th, 1698. According to those regulations, foreign merchants were permitted to sell cloth, spices, and similar goods only at the annual fairs, and that exclusively for a period of 2 days. If the foreign merchants did not adhere to that term, the local merchants were authorized by a permit issued by the city magistrate to confiscate their goods and then to deliver them to the city government and be compensated with a third of the goods' value. Jesus, that's onerous. An, an insight can be obtained into the appearance and content of the royal fair at the beginning of the 19th century on the basis of a newspaper article from 1826 printed in Luna Agremer Zeitschrift, a Zagreb newspaper published in German. If we can believe the author, the fair was visited in that year by people from the most distant parts of the country in the impressive number of 10,000 souls. This was undoubtedly an imposing figure, taking into account that Zagreb had only 16,000 inhabitants at the time. 300 stalls were erected on the Harmika Square, selling the most diverse merchandise, from dried fish, Hungarian cheese, bacon, soap, and tobacco, through homespun cloth, ribbons and thread, cloth, boots, and moccasins, to goods made by craftsmen, such as harness and belt makers, furriers, basket weavers, coopers, and stonemasons who made millstones. One could buy hay, wood for fuel, horned livestock, horses, and other domestic animals on the other side of the fairgrounds, opposite the stalls. And what was an offer as entertainment? The author of the article mentions Rosie's Menagerie, made up of several monkeys, a lion and a lioness, a Senegal tiger, a bear, a porcupine, and exotic birds. And he continues, quote, Meyerhofer from Vienna also came to the fair and opened up the Theatrum Mundi, that is, a geographic stage to which the crowds just flock. They have a magician, advertised as Hercules, from the far north, and there are also amusement parks for children and adults, according to Herc, 1987:107. End quote. If there were places that were attractive to the common folk, there was also a dance organized in a theater building on the last day of the fair, which was attended by, quote, many from higher society, end quote. However, the fairgrounds at Harmika were becoming an obstacle to Zagreb's further development, so the city fathers moved it to new locations 3 times during the 19th century. It was first moved somewhat south of Harmika to what was then a field and is now Nicholas Subchik Zernsky Square, where the fair was held from 1826 until 1869. The Zagreb naturalist and journalist Dragutic Herc, 1853 to 1921, described the appearance of that fair as he remembered it from the time of his childhood. While the western side was occupied by the stalls, where the adults ate, drank, sang, and danced, wrote Herc, the southeastern side was there the merry-go-round was placed, to the delight of the children. The merry-go-round was owned by a certain Vincenzo Frace and his wife Anna, and they had transported it from Wiener Neustadt. When work began on transforming the square into a park, the fair was moved in 1872 and functioned for the next 18 years on the site of what is today one of Zagreb's most beautiful city squares, dominated by the luxuriant building of the Croatian National Theater, built in 1895. However, on the eve of preparations for the Gospodarska Izložba, that is business exhibition, which is particularly important for the Croatian economy, that was held at that location in 1891, the fair was moved again, that time to the eastern border of the city. Between 1890 and 1920, the fairs were organized on the eastern side of what is now Druskovich Street, covering the area of today's Franjo Rocky Street, Fascist Victim Square, and King Petar Kresimer IV's Square. The above notation by the Obzor reporter from 1900 referred to that very space. Part 4. How did the fairs unfold in the first 2 decades of the 20th century? Newspaper sources testify that all 3 fairs were still being held. Mark's in April, Margaret's in July, and the Royal Fair in August. Their duration reflected their importance. Mark's lasts 2 days, Margaret's 3, while the most famous Zagreb and General Fair, the Royal Fair, lasts for 8 days. But here's a footnote, a little bit of gossip. It would seem, however, that Mark's Fair was losing its significance, judging from the description of a contemporary in 1909. Quote, there are 2 large annual fairs in Zagreb, known even to children throughout Croatia, one being Margaret's Fair and the other one held at the time of St. Stephen's, Kraljevo. I don't think that footnote wasn't necessary. The fairs were still announced. Fine, it was necessary. I don't want you to be mad at me. If the author ever hears this, I don't want you to be mad at me. I had concerns about the footnote. The fairs were still announced and marked in the medieval mode. The great bell of the cathedral rang out to announce the fair's commencement. Only the flag that flew for 2 weeks from the bell tower was different. It was no longer red, but was replaced by the Croatian state tricolor. Despite considerably altered economic circumstances, industrial development in the first place, the offer of livestock and agricultural products still prevailed. Here's the passage. Here you can find wonderful horned livestock of the best breeds, a large host of horses. There is riding. One can drive and haggle, while a large number of members of the domestic public are very interested in that type of trade. There are many foreign merchants. That's Obazur, August 21st, 1900. End quote. That was confirmed by a description published 10 years later. Another quote. This is from Sorolla, 1909, 582. Quote, from all sides of our homeland, Croatia, and from neighboring countries, thousands of head of livestock are driven to the fair, so that our horse traders, butchers, and farmers do a brisk trade, end quote. Among the foreign merchants, Italians, Styrians, and Carniolians, that is, Slovenians, are directly mentioned as buyers of horses. Trade in livestock was duly recorded and reported in the press after the fair had ended. For example, 667 head of horned livestock, 270 horses, 420 pigs, and 100 calves. Obzor, July 14, 1900. All those animals were brought to the 1900 Margaret Fair, while 14 years later the numbers were 2,926 head of beef, 195 calves, 3,077 horses, and 842 pigs. As well as trade in livestock, hay, straw, and fuel wood were also sold there in 1914, and 150 carts loaded with these goods arrived at the fair. The merchandise sections of the fairs of that time were also taken by craftsmen products, and domestic and foreign merchants took part in this trade. It was precisely stated that domestic cobblers, gingerbread makers, umbrella makers, and tailors exhibited their goods in the tents at Mark's Fair in 1912, while at Margaret's Fair they still bring kitchen dishes, the Czechs, cloth, the Slovaks, and wooden goods, the Slovenians. Obzor, July 12th, 1905. It was noted that merchants selling furniture did good business in 1909. Obzor, July 14th, 1909. While the next year, there were more merchants at the fair selling cloth and dishes, so they had to display their merchandise on the ground. Obzor, the next year. A surviving photograph taken at the Royal Fair in 1909 confirms that pottery products were laid out on the ground. Prosvietia, 17th:580. While one can detect the benches of clothing merchants on a photograph from the same fair in 1908. Prosvieta, another citation. While trade took place at the fairgrounds by day, the focus of the evening events transferred to the, quote, this is from Cirola. Anyway. While trade took place at the fairgrounds by day, the focus of the evening events transferred to the, quote, part emitting the enticing aromas of roast meat of very many types, the traditional booths with real home-like service, and a variety of music, were full of thirsty, hungry people, so that the entertainment lasted on to almost midnight. And here's an entire town of booths and tents occupied by Zagreb tavern keepers who pour a fine wee drop for the folk. The tavern and innkeepers who wished to participate at the fairs had to ensure themselves a place by applying to the supervisors of the fair within an exactly defined term several days before the fair opened. One could not apply unless one held a special permit, a document that authorized its bearer to serve wine and beer at fairs and local parish fetes. The statistical reports published in the newspapers after the close of each fair gave exact information on the amount of wine served and drunk, so that, for example, 212 hectoliters of wine was served and consumed at Margaret's Fair in 1906, while 120 hectoliters and 69 liters was served and consumed at the 1914 fair, Obzor, Novosti. The favorite foods were sucking pigs and lamb roasted on the spit, and it was revealed in Obzor 1908 that 201 lambs were roasted. The most highly rated barbecue stall operators were those from Sistine and Grachani, still real villages at that time in the direct vicinity of Zagreb, whose Slindelbraten the people of Zagreb jostled to buy. That's Novosti, 1912. This is made from pieces of pork roasted on a kebab. Quote, alongside this troupe of barbecue stall operators, writes Cirola, describing the 1909 Royal Fair, there is a whole series of bakers and bread sellers who take care that those thousands of people who come to the fair do not faint from hunger. The gastronomic offer was also expanded by caterers from Bosnia who served real Turkish black coffee and also offered their refreshing domestic drink, boza. Boza is an oriental drink that has a sourish taste made from corn semolina and sugar. The people of Zagreb loved their fairs and visited them enthusiastically. Both the pious among them, who filled the cathedral to overflowing on St. Stephen's Day, as well as the less religious ones, who made their way to the fairgrounds in such numbers that, quote, the tavern and innkeepers could not supply enough chairs and benches for their guests. As we know from before, there was more than mere eating and drinking taking place. The better tavern keepers also engaged musicians, either village tambrizza musicians or Romani bands, or even some accordion players. So there was no lack of dancing either. Another quote. Songs and the playing of Magyar gypsies ring out, the tinkling sound of the tamburitzas beneath the tents, and here and there the dancing of the famous Dremes dance. Footnote 8. The Dremes dance is a very widely distributed Croatian folk dance, performed to singing or music accompaniment and characterized by a shaking movement of the body. What else made up the contents of the Zagreb annual fairs in the first decades of the 20th century? What was the source of their noise and caused the flurry? What contributed to it all being, as we can read in Obzor in 1900, that is, quote, lively and merry everywhere. Even then, the interest of the fairground in the menageries had not waned. Admittedly, it must be borne in mind that the city did not have a zoo at that time. It would be founded only in 1925. One of the then inhabitants of Zagreb, the eminent journalist and feuilleton writers, that is, Krasimir Kovacic, somewhat mockingly noted that at the menageries, quote, they usually had a starving and raggedy wolf and a similar lion, which the greatest attraction was a sleepy bear and a seal who blew out matches when they were lit by anybody in front of his nose. End quote. It did not happen at that time either that there could be a fair without a merry-go-round or a swing for adults in the shape of a boat. In the well-known book Tonkina Jadina Lubov, that is Tonka's Only Love, published in 1931 and written by August Cesarak, 1893-1941, a major part of the story takes place precisely at the Zagreb fairgrounds, in whose vicinity the author himself lived, so that he had direct experience of the fair. That was a source of this description, quote, a red and white striped linen cover with cane struts was now spread above the swings, and the boats flew high as if on the tallest waves, with the beak-like ram ends almost rending the linen sky. The cover was removed from the merry-go-round, and the wooden knightly horses rushed in a circle to the music of the Nickelodeon, circling as if around the entire world of the royal box. That is Cesarak, 1966:28. A roller coaster powered by a steam engine joined the merry-go-round and the swings in 1909. Shooting ranges were also popular, and the male visitors fired at targets, both moving and stationary, in order to impress their graceful companions with their sharp eyes and precise right hands, while they could also throw cloth balls or balls filled with sawdust at various moving figures and, in the event of hitting the targets, be given a prize. And there were magicians there, too. Quote, the Schwarzkünstlers, Footnote 9. From the German Schwarzkünstler, that is, a magician. The Schwarzkünstlers made an egg out of a handkerchief, a rabbit out of an egg, and a silver 5 crown coin out of a rabbit, which suddenly disappeared into the pocket of an onlooker. Reported Kovacic, 1990:125. Carrying on the tradition from the foregoing centuries, acrobats entertained the public in this era too, and took their breath away. But the panoramas, gadgets that made possible a sculptural view of the photographs of particular events, were also popular. Since the pictures were viewed through a magnifying glass, the objects were experienced as if in natural size, with which made them particularly attractive. Admittedly, dissatisfied customers claimed that it often happened that the same event was shown for several years. However, in 1903, Observer's reporter from the Royal Fair wrote, the main attractions among the panoramas that year was the one showing Queen Draga and King Alexander, which was really a very recent event. It showed the murder of the Serbian royal couple, members of the Obrenović dynasty, carried out on May 29th in an official plot. Sazerac brought closer the horrifying scenes from the panoramas. Quote, how Russian Cossacks fall into wolf caves dug out by the Japanese, and how people in the jungle fight with tigers. End quote. Equally attractive were the panopticums, collections of wax figures. Kovacevic's descriptions write of girls with moving eyes, a Turkish sultan with his hands in a position for prayer, the dying Russian Tsar Alexander III with blood spurting from his swollen chest, and any other wax figure that was intended to depict the most current political personalities. While Sazerac noted, quote, dissected human figures made of wax, so that at least here, even without a doctor, everyone can learn what she looks like on the inside. End quote. Everyone visited the photographers who offered the fantastic opportunity for that time of having a photograph taken that would be developed in 3 minutes. On August 19th, 1905, Obzor's readers could learn that the Royal Fair was offering one more type of lovely and educative entertainment, sought by all the more intelligent strata of Zagreb society. The bioscope, or cinema, the youthful writings of the journalist Josip Horvat, 1896-1968, confirms that the cinema really did make its first appearance in Zagreb at the fairgrounds during the Royal Fair. Quote, that Buckmeyer bioscope was a large tent which had a locomobile from that produced electricity and a terrible smell. But at that time, the cinema had not yet managed to make a strong impression on the people. With its program of short, flickering episodes, in which some people were constantly running around and breaking plates, which was funny at first, but then became boring with its monotony. End quote. There is no doubt that the Zagreb annual fairs were a meeting place between the citizens and the villagers, who gathered there either as vendors or as buyers, and sometimes only as onlookers at the fair's attractions or as participants in the parties. Block quote. That is a real mixture of all strata of the population. Apart from merchants and craftsmen, one sees villagers both from the environs of Zagreb and from the fertile Posavina region and rich Srejum, from the rugged littoral and from proud Bosnia. The people have flocked here from all sides, and all that mixture lives and buzzes like a huge swarm of bees. It is especially lively in the evening, when a mass of city dwellers flock to the fairgrounds. Then an authentic popular celebration develops, which lasts until late into the night, testifies Cirola. While an anonymous writer of a newspaper item about the Royal Fair concluded, Apart perhaps at local village fetes, such diverse elements never meet at the same table, as happens at the Zagreb fairgrounds. A newspaper report about the Royal Fair in 1911 speaks of the large number of visitors from near and far and makes special mention of the villagers who, apart from attending the church services, also have a detailed look around the fair. This peasant population is largely dressed in folk costume, and it is a delight to see them, says the reporter. Tomislav Cividini, working in tourism at that time, agreed with him. In his publication Grad Zagreb kao središte prometa stranaka I Hirovoshkoj I Slavoniji, that is, I should have skipped to the title, the city of Zagreb as the focus of travel by foreigners in Croatia and Slavonia, published in 1912, supported the idea that foreigners should primarily be shown domestic autochthonous values and not quote unquote world achievements. According to Cividini, such assets could be best perceived precisely at the fairs, because it was there that one found music, dance, folk costumes, and the barbecue grill cooks. The Zagreb craftsmen and merchants of that time were more than interested in taking part at the fairs, and they tried then, too, as in foregoing centuries, to ensure their primacy in the face of the invasion of their foreign colleagues. This can be deduced from their protests submitted to the city government on the eve of Margaret's Fair in 1913. Their petition asked that they, as the Zagreb craftsmen who, quote unquote, regularly pay all our taxes and tariffs, be permitted, as is customary with the tavern keepers, to ensure that their sales position ahead of time. They pointed out that a large number of external and foreign merchants will definitely be rushing to the fair, and that they wanted to avoid a repetition of the quarrels and fights that are known to take place. The person they regarded as being accountable for such a situation was the director of the site, accusing him of giving priority to the foreign merchants, so that he simply comes and dislodges the domestic merchant. Unfortunately, we do not know what the outcome was of these fairground tensions and whether the domestic merchants managed to secure justice. Zagreb's better public is mentioned among the fair visitors. Admittedly, it is not clear which social stratum was in question, but it is obvious that the members of that world did not come to the fair to buy or sell. They will probably encamp at the fair this evening to enjoy the well-loved fairground ambrosia. A comment on Margaret's Fair in 1903, while a report on the Royal Fair in Novosti on August 20th, 1911 says, "Our elegant people also went to the fairgrounds last night to spend a pleasant evening at the wooden stalls with a glass of wine and the well-known grilled sausages." As well as noting the presence of people from the factories, workshops, kitchens, and army barracks as visitors to the fair, A. Cesarak spoke of the so-called Cilindrasi, the top hat crowd, as he mockingly called the members of the civil servant and other non-proletarian strata. But the better people also found themselves among visitors from the provinces. In coming to Zagreb, some of these were not interested solely in participating at the fairs, but wanted to fulfill their more cultural needs. This can be seen from newspaper items on their displeasure because of the impossibility of seeing the university library mansion, which, built in the succession style, graced the city from 1913. Our provincials complain to us that when they come to Zagreb at the time of the Royal Fair, they never find the university library open, and they would gladly see this brilliantly designed cultural institution. They have read so much about the luxuriant building and the luxurious interior decoration, but when they would like to see and to revel in the cultural development of their nation, then the doors are closed to them. Efforts should be made to fulfill this justified popular wish. Along with all the other participants that it attracted, the fair was also a magnet for the less established world, the world of the vagrants, swindlers, and petty thieves. The honest citizenry had to be protected from them, and the following is an extract from the crime pages of Novosti in 1913. Since Margaret's Fair is taking place, and all sorts of suspicious individuals make their way to Zagreb on such occasions, the police undertook a raid last night. The most extensive bag was at the fairgrounds, where 14 persons were arrested for vagrancy. 13 of them were men, and there was also one woman. Certain suspicious characters infiltrated the fair public at the Royal Fair in 1903, palming off counterfeit money. Although the notes were of fairly poor workmanship, the police had to admit that they had not managed to trace the counterfeiters. Large fairs were also an opportunity for beggars, who gathered there from all over. They too, like the caterers, merchants, and craftsmen, wanted to have their own defined place of business at the fair. But since they were unable to reach a gentleman's agreement in that respect, they quarreled and fought at the Royal Fair in 1905 and ended up in hospital. All these were components of the dynamic goings-on at the eastern edge of the city, whose attractive nature could not be resisted even by the pen of the author and feuilletoniste Anton Gustav Matos. His conclusion on the Royal Fair of 1920 reads as follows. Zagreb and the provinces have set themselves a meeting in these sunny days that are as red and juicy as a watermelon in life, so that the domestic population is boiling, blooming, and flowing here like a river of wine and joy in the vulgar likability of a folk celebration. And what the Royal Fair meant for children of elementary school age and how they experienced it can be seen from the oral testimony of a little girl who took part. Born in 1897, this little girl from Zagreb, Marija F.P., speaking about the memories from her childhood, mentioned how she remembered those events from the time before World War I. In her estimation, the fair was one of the city's prominent events, which attracted visitors from all corners of the country. It was particularly interesting to children, so that Marija and her brothers saved all year, especially for that occasion. Her father, a worker at one of Zagreb's sawmills, would take her to the fair on a Sunday when he was free from work. They would first go to the stands with various trinkets, where the vendor would stand, shouting, everything for seven kroshkars. When the children were satisfied with buying, among other, glass figures in the form of angels or animals and similar baubles, their father would take them to one of the taverners' tents. There they would eat barbecued meat, and the children would drink the typical fairground beverage called krahurl, made of soda water and certain sweet additives. Marija remembered that the meat was not as good as when Mama bakes it, but we thought it was wonderful. We were delighted. Because of their father's interest, they would go to look at the part of the fair where their livestock was on display, and then, to the joy of the children, they would carry on to the sideshow section. They particularly enjoyed the shooting galleries, supplied with small cupboards containing various mechanisms. When anyone hit the center of the board, said Marija, the little door would open and reveal the scene of a sawman sawing wood. In another cupboard, a grandfather was rocking a baby in a cradle, and Tyroleans were dancing in a tavern in another. That was all very exciting to the children. To the contrary, the panopticon was repulsive to the little girl. I did not like the wax figures, as if I was looking at corpses, she said, and asked her father to move on. And she found the visit to the panorama more disturbing than enjoyable. There was a woman there with two heads, and a sea virgin, half woman, half fish. A boy told me that the virgin had been caught in the sea, but I could not believe that sea virgins really existed. Somehow I could not grasp that it would be possible. She also mentioned the harlequins, some sort of actors, half-dressed, who argued and chased each other, but the memory of them had already faded. After Marija and her brothers had looked at everything, returning home, excited and happy, they would tell their mother all about their experiences and show the purchases upon which they had spent their savings. Evoking those experiences, Marija, now 68 years old, finished her statement with these words: all the people of my age who are still alive remember the Royal Fair in Zagreb. It was a first-class sensation. However, life in Zagreb changed in the late summer of 1914, when its inhabitants, too, were drawn into the vortex of World War I. So the Royal Fair that year, according to newspaper articles, was only a pale image of its predecessors, with a considerably lower participation of vendors that was usual, and far fewer customers. The typical fair hubbub was replaced by silence. However, after this initial pause, the fairs were to show the persistence of their existence already in the following 1915, when there was a revitalization of trade and interest among visitors. Admittedly, there were far fewer young men in the crowds, since they were absent, fulfilling their duties toward the homeland, but, on the other hand, there were numerous participants from the provinces who took the opportunity to combine their visits to mobilized relatives in the military barracks or to injured war veterans and convalescents in the hospitals with their visits to the fairs. The people of Zagreb recognized them by their typical dress. Here one could see the most highly varied folk costumes from various parts of our homeland. It was said in Novosti on August 22nd, 1915. Apart from shopping, those visitors undoubtedly tried the various carousels and swings, looked at the panorama images and the panopticon displays, and tried their hand at the shooting galleries located around the fairgrounds. The photographers were also very busy in making a photograph or two as a souvenir for the departing soldiers and their relatives. The range of domestic goods on offer did not change to any extent, but the vendors of the so-called colonial goods, such as chocolate and vanilla, had disappeared completely. The fairs continued to live their lives even in the coming war years, although they were somewhat subdued and even changed in some aspects. So it was that a reporter on the 1917 Margaret's Fair took particular notice of the fact that there were many more women at the section of the fair where livestock was being sold, demonstrating their predominance at that time in managing their own business activities, which they had had to take over instead of the absent men, who were preoccupied with their military obligations. Still, there were merry-go-rounds and swings at that fair, too, as testified to by Novosti, July 14, 1917, as well as similar devices to entertain the rural and urban visitors, while only the shortage of bread was a reminder that those were times of war. The ominous aura of the last year of the war was seen in the absence of one of the emblems of the annual fairs. Although, as in the long series of previous years and even centuries, the Royal Fair had been announced in that year of 1918 by the hoisting of the flag on the bell tower of the cathedral, the chiming of the great bell was absent for the first time. The reason was a banal one. The setting in motion of that huge, heavy bell had to be carried out by 7 powerful men, but, according to a newspaper report, there were simply no such men available. It was as though that symbolic act augured the fading away of the phenomenon initiated in the Middle Ages and consistently observed over the following centuries. It would not be able to survive any longer in its full former glory in the coming period. Here's footnote 12. This is about the bell. The great bell was cast by Henrik Dagen in 1843. He was a German from Lübeck, who was the lessee at the time of the chapter bell casting foundry, established as long ago as in 1459. The size of that bell is spoken of in comparison with the previously cast cathedral bell. While the first one weighed 4,959 pounds, the new bell was twice as heavy, weighing a full 11,525 pounds. It is 7 feet in diameter, 21 feet in circumference, and has a height of 6 feet. Dagen had an especially sturdy cart built to transport the bell from the foundry to the cathedral, and it was pulled by 8 powerful oxen decked out in ribbons and flowers. Namely, that was the first celebration at which many of Zagreb's people gathered, including some who did not believe that they would succeed in lifting the huge bell up into the bell tower. The courageous Dagen, convinced of the exactness of his calculations, was prepared to be buried alive by the bell in the event that the scaffolding collapsed. The scaffolding held out. The largest bell in Croatia was raised to its place. Dagen remained alive, and the doubtful ones were obliged to give full credit to the master craftsman. End of footnote. Admittedly, the fairs were still held in the following 2 years at the same location. However, as a result of the unstoppable growth of Zagreb and the accompanying urban modernization, they were once again relocated to the new urban edge, increasingly losing their significance as social entertainment events. That golden Zagreb mood that can be understood and comprehended only by someone from here, which had been an essential component of the annual fairs, was to disappear in the face of the approaching circumstances of another way of life. In the years following the end of World War I and the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Zagreb was to transform into a center of finance, modern trade, and industry. As a member of the newly constituted state community, the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The former great annual fairs as the meeting point of the most diverse people of the monde and the demi-monde, occasions strongly marked by their vitality and picturesque scenery would, however, be given their artistic transposition. We find it in the play Kraljevo, written by the leading Croatian writer, the Zagreb-born Miroslav Kreza, and published in 1918. The underlying concept of that work, with the dramatic events woven into it, constitutes almost all the elements of the entertainment part of the fairs. In that way, thanks to Kreza's incisive text, the atmosphere of the Zagreb annual fairs has outlived its actual existence.